Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another video. So today I have a special interview with Jake Carlson, who is from apologistproject.org. Jake is a software engineer who has created a Christian chatbot that can answer questions about the Bible and Christianity. I realize that many of you are not Christians, but the things that we talk about in this video really pertains to any domain. And Jake has a really unique perspective on AI. The beauty of his project, in my view, is that it attempts to provide AI with a worldview. Now, I know that's not possible, it's AI, but it allows the chatbot to reason, but constrained from a particular domain. So we discuss faith-based AI, the ethics of creating a Christian chatbot, and how to get started with a similar project if you're interested as well. All right, let's go. Today, I have Jake Carlson with me, and he is the president of apologistproject.org, which is a company that does a lot of apologetics related things on their website. One of which is building a apologetics chatbot, which is I'm especially interested in. So if you guys aren't aware of what apologetics is, it's basically a command for Christians to always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for what we believe in. This is a commandment from the Bible. And so that's what is kind of like in the background of the company. So welcome, Jake.
Yeah, thanks for having me here, Bobby.
So tell me about yourself. What's your background?
Yeah, so I actually was a missionary kid in China. My parents brought us over there, and my parents were tent makers. So I grew up there, and I in China went to a private Christian school. And in the course of my studies there, we had lots of worldview classes, and so that got me really interested in apologetics and worldview studies and so forth. Came back to the States, started a career in software engineering. I like to describe myself as a very T-shaped individual, so I wouldn't call myself the best software engineer in the world, but I have a lot of broad skills. So I do UX design as well, and started my own consulting firm. So some on the business side as well, and actually ended up getting a degree in design while at the same time working professionally as a software engineer. So I've worked for several startups here in the States, in Austin in particular, where I call home right now. And in addition to startups, I've also worked for some big tech companies as well. I've worked for Oracle and Apple. And then recently, in the last 5 or 6 years, I've actually transitioned over to becoming a product manager, kind of using that T-shaped skill set.
Oh, very interesting. So you have a really well-rounded background in what we're dealing with here. What inspired you to create a Christian or apologetics chatbot?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, when I was just coming out of high school and becoming really interested in apologetics, we're talking late 90s, early 2000s. So, that kind of dates me a little bit. I'm an old guy. And it was during the nascent stages of the web becoming popularized as a communication tool. And back then, I really saw just a ton of online discourse, but it was more of kind of an atheist or a humanist bias. And back then, I kind of made a promise to God and myself that one day I would kind of raise up an answer to that in the form of some kind of like apologetics community. So, of course, AI existed back then, but it wasn't anything that I really was aware of. And then last year, when I started this endeavor, ChatGPT had obviously become very popular, and there were a couple other commercial AIs that were conversational AIs that were becoming kind of in the mind share of the public. And I thought to myself, well, I love this idea of a community, but let's start with AI. Let's start there and see if we can build something that Christians can use and might be a witness to non-believers as well.
Hmm. Yeah, and that brings me to my next question, which is the main purpose of a Christian chatbot. What do you think is the primary audience, or at least yours? What is the prime audience, and what are maybe some use cases that you had in mind when you started this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll expound on that a little bit. So being a missionary kid, I've always been kind of missionally minded and very focused on evangelism, fulfilling the Great Commission. And so I think that our chatbot actually has a couple use cases, but in the end, it's all about evangelism. So obviously, the most basic one is we hope that non-believers stumble upon our chatbots and ask it hard questions and get good answers based on the biblical worldview. But we also have found that many believers need a quick resource to answer the same questions that they're being asked by non-believers. So we hope that it will be both a tool for believers to indirectly witness to non-believers, but also a direct tool to non-believers getting access to information about God, Jesus, and the Bible.
Mhm. Yeah, I really agree with that. I mean, I can attest personally. It's been about maybe 2 or 3 weeks since I actually found out about your project, and I've been using it in my kind of daily reflections and everything like that. And I can say it's at least it's been a help to me. So I can attest to that at the very least. And the other thing I'm glad you mentioned evangelism here because the second part of what I mentioned before was do it with gentleness and respect. So like
Yes.
give an answer for what you believe in. But I think a lot of times we lack the second part, which is do it with gentleness and respect. And one of the things I asked your chatbot was I
Uh-oh.
was a little bit confused with one of the passages in Matthew. So I gave it a question. I don't remember off the top of my head. Um, but the first thing it said was such an insightful question. And here is what I would say to that.
Yeah.
And it disagreed with me. It disagreed with my viewpoint, but
Okay.
it disagreed very gently. So was this something that's done intentionally or like is it
Absolutely.
we'll get
Yeah.
into the technical stuff in a second, but yeah,
Sure. Yeah,
was this something you
absolutely.
had in your
So,
mind?
yeah, without getting too technical, we definitely trained the bot to literally it's been instructed to speak with empathy, right? Such as the case that it can with it being a synthetic entity or whatever. But it is very much instructed to be act lovingly toward the user, not only speak truth but also to act lovingly, because that's a huge part of it. To your point, I think First Peter 3:16 I think is a reference, if I have it
Mm,
right, where
yes.
it kind of talks about using gentleness and respect, but having that ready answer. So I think both parts are important, because if you yell at somebody or speak in a mean way, it doesn't matter whether you say is true or not. It's not going to be received well. And so we want to be winsome when we're interacting with non-believers, so that if they perceive that level of love toward them, then they'll be more receptive toward the truth that's also being expressed.
Yeah, I totally agree. Um, let's get into a little bit of the ethical side of this before we get into the technical stuff, which I think a lot of my audience is more interested in. But but ethically, um, before I always tell my students before you get into a project, you always have to do a risk analysis, do a feasibility study. What kind of things are you going to run into? What kind of problems? What kind of pitfalls are there? And then also kind of balance this with ACM Code of Ethics. Are you benefiting society? Are you doing some harm to society? What kind of analysis did you do before you started this project, and what were your main concerns at the beginning of the project?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, we kind of started with kind of a proof of concept. We wanted to make sure that it would be beneficial to society. If we produce something that is, leads people astray, that's a real, potential pitfall of using a system like this, right? We're relying on, obviously, an AI that's been, trained to do something, but it's not. It's somewhat autonomous in how it interprets the probabilities that it's going to answer in a certain way. And so through a lot of analysis and kind of validation, we first thing we did was try to figure out what base model were we going to use for our agent, and we kind of compared and contrasted the answers. We evaluated the biases that each bot kind of brought to the table, and then what effect our instructions to the various different bots that were available had. And one of the concerns that we had initially was, if we use a commercial model like OpenAI or Google Gemini, um, we wouldn't really have control over that entity building in new biases without us knowing about it, right? And so that's why we gravitated toward an open source model based on that analysis, because at least in that case, we can know without a shadow of a doubt that what we built into it won't be changed by an external entity. And so that was part of the risk analysis as well, is just making sure that the base model, number one, gave a base level good response, but also wouldn't have the potential for outside actors to influence it in some way.
I see. Wow. So in doing some research for this for this interview, I stumbled across, some I guess some articles or some people that were against doing
Sure.
things like this, either a Christian chatbot or apologetics or for anything Christian related.
Okay.
So I have a couple of concerns. I wonder if you could
Absolutely.
respond to these for me. How would you respond to someone who would say that this violates the second commandment, which is to not make any graven images?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple ways to respond to that depending on exactly what's meant, but certainly we wouldn't want anybody to think of the chatbot as replacing, God's word or anything like that, right? Or even a deity itself, right? So the chatbot is trained to frame things as if it were just, the general term, a helpful assistant to help somebody understand something, not take the place of some, embodied entity or something like that. And so definitely, that is a concern, but I think we're fortunate in the sense that most base models do not they tend to kind of admit that they're an AI, and not a real
Hmm.
not a real biological entity or any kind of like deity or anything like that. So we didn't have to do a whole lot to prevent that kind of response from happening. But in a general sense, like I think if we kind of stick to the topics that are asked rather than making like statements of grandeur or something like that, you could definitely do that. You could build a bot that overstates its abilities or even like its nature or something like that. But of course we kept our training of the model very grounded in what it was, and that it was just trying to be helpful to help the user understand theological concepts.
Yeah. Um, and kind of picking up on that point, your AI does say that, it's not this is there is a possibility of falsehoods.
Mm,
So that said, how do you respond to another criticism, which
yeah,
is the potential fabrication of false information,
right,
and that the ends doesn't really justify the means being the falsehoods
right.
of the bot,
Yeah.
and that it should because of this, it shouldn't be used for apologetics or Christian
Yeah, and I get
purposes.
this objection once in a while, right? By and large, it's been very well received, but occasionally some will say, well, you don't know 100% what the output's going to be. It could present something that's theologically wrong, right? And lead people astray. Like that's definitely a possibility, right? And so the way I respond to that is basically like, okay, well, couple threads here. One is, well, we use a technique, and we can get this more into the technical portion, but we use a technique called a retrieval augmented generation to ground the model's responses in only the information that we wanted it to draw from in order to answer the question. And that body of knowledge has been curated by us. And so, in other words, yes, the base model has been, trained initially on, whatever it was trained on, half the internet or whatever, right? Depending on the model. But when we instruct the chatbot to answer, we say, okay, but draw from this specific body of knowledge that we're giving you context on. And that technique called retrieval augmented generation has been proven to reduce hallucinations. So that's more of like a technical, explanation of the guardrails that we have in place. But let me back up and be a little bit more philosophical here, if you'll permit me.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, sure.
um, not to put too fine a point on it, but every day, young, inexperienced kids basically are being put out into the mission field to promote the word of God. They make lots of mistakes. They yell at people. They, probably say a lot of things that are theologically really not great, right? Um, but we still do it. And why do we still do it? And it's because there's a couple reasons we do it. One is, nonetheless, those people need to be trained up in how to be better about those things, right? So you'll never learn unless you put people into positions where they can learn from those positions through those challenges. And number two, though, is that the question is it doing more good than harm, right? And that's not to say that ends justify the means, but there is a certain risk tolerance that people are willing to allow in order for a good to happen, right? It is possible that I could, even as an older individual who maybe feels a little bit more, strong in their theology, it is certainly possible that I will make a mistake. In fact, it's a very obvious and possible in reality that I will make a mistake when I'm talking to somebody. I'll recall a fact incorrectly. I'll be cranky because I didn't get enough sleep. I will sin. There is no question about whether I will sin or not, right? But the idea that because I have the potential of making a mistake, that therefore I should never try to evangelize, I think is incorrect. You have to weigh these things against kind of the possible good, and it is a real possibility that in any AI system that there will be the potential for hallucinations, but we have kind of those guardrails in place so that hopefully it will be minimized. I use an analogy often about this that actually a friend gave me, which is let's talk about self-driving cars for a second, right? So self-driving cars, it's a little scary. Like I'll admit it. Like the idea that a bunch of self-driving cars would be driving around is kind of freaky, just to be honest, right? But the question isn't whether those self-driving cars will kill people. They absolutely will kill people. There's no question. There will be circumstances in which self-driving cars will kill people. But that's not the question you need to answer. The question you need to answer is, will they kill more people than people, right? So in other words, is the likelihood of a self-driving car having an accident higher than a person having an accident? And if the likelihood of a person having an accident is actually higher, then I would argue that a self-driving car actually is justified, right? So it's not about whether, in my opinion, whether there will ever be a mistake made. It's whether the risk of that mistake is an acceptable trade-off for the benefit that you're willing to shoot for.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. Um, what are some positive feedback that you've received from your chatbot, and what do people find most helpful, I guess?
Yeah, well, first of all, you've just given me some, so thank you for that. But yeah, I've heard of people using it for Bible studies. That's more the internal existing believer use case, and they find it very instructive. I've also we recently hooked up our chatbot to Hotjar and have been kind of like looking in on sessions where people are actually entering things. We recently had questions about people having difficult times in their marriage or like theological viewpoints on certain things, and we have people using it from India and Kazakhstan and just Turkey, all over the map, right? And it's very apparent that it's been useful. We're logging every single prompt that comes in anonymously and all the responses, and so we can then go back and review it. But just anecdotally, right, without appealing to any kind of data or statistics. A lot of people have come back to me and said like this is really impactful, both for folks in the missions field to be able to quickly pull up as a reference, and also just from believers who really want that kind of resource in their daily walk with God.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, Before we transition over to a more technical side, I want to and correct me if I'm wrong because I'm speaking from kind of a naive point of view. I'm quite ignorant on this whole area, but in my opinion, your domain specifically, in apologetics, there really is not any new knowledge, meaning like a lot of objections about Christianity
Yeah,
has been around for many, many years. First of all, do you agree with that? And secondly,
yeah,
does that make your job of curating and maintaining the chatbot a little bit easier?
yeah.
Because oftentimes, when I'm confronted with a question, I know I've heard it somewhere. I just can't recall it, right? And I can't recall in the manner that it was answered. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So how do you view that?
Yeah, great question. So my answer is it depends on the specific subdiscipline of apologetics. I would agree with you that, on the more philosophical side, definitely there's probably no new arguments at this point. We're talking about the problem of evil, existential questions, those kinds of things. Those are not going to be there's not new data that's really going to come to light very, very readily from a philosophical standpoint, right? So from that perspective, I would 100% agree with you that there's not a whole lot of new material. However, even on that front, the arguments can be contextualized for new generations in different ways. And the analogies that people draw on, the life experiences that they draw on, can definitely speak to generations in different ways. And so even there, I would argue there's definitely fertile ground for kind of new materials and new responses, new ways to respond to those even age-old questions. But that's more for the philosophical side. There are also plenty of other subdisciplines within apologetics. The most obvious of which I would argue would be science, and of course there are new scientific discoveries that are made every day that either raise objections or confirm the Christian worldview. And I think from that perspective, there's always going to be an influx of new information from that perspective. So it just depends on like what sub-discipline of apologetics we're talking about. But definitely from a philosophical standpoint, there's very few, if no, new questions raised from a philosophical standpoint.
Yeah. Um, just before we kind of leave this section on ethics, I find that a lot of times we have, I guess, trouble decoupling the fact that AI is really just responding. They don't really have like a reasoning mechanism, and they're not really making truth claims, but we treat it as if it's making truth claims. So I think, yeah, this is something that I guess a lot of users have to kind of wrap their head around as well.
Yeah, I could speak to that just for a moment if you'll permit.
Yeah.
I've heard it described to me that a large language model is like a word calculator. All it's really doing is it's ingesting a bunch of data and based on statistical probability, constructing a response. And as it's constructing the response, it's always recalculating what the next most appropriate thing to say based on a probabilistic model, right? And so you
Mhm.
can, yes, you can inject some variance to that by, increasing the temperature and make it a little bit more creative, but it's all still based off of word probabilities based on its corpus. So it's still garbage in, garbage out. If you restrict the information that's used to draw on through some mechanism like retrieval augmented generation in our case, then it's going to respond in a way that falls in line with that. So it does heavily depend on what it's trained on and what it's provided in real time during its response.
Mhm. So I know we've got into a lot of technical
Sorry.
material already. That's okay. No, I really like that aspect of it. A lot of my viewers here are probably going to be my students in computer science. So maybe we can answer these questions in to a kind of a semi-technical audience.
Sure.
Um, so if I'm new to this area and perhaps I want to start a project, perhaps in a different domain, in my own domain,
Yeah.
um, how would we be able to defend our data and to be able to even just get started with such a project?
Yeah, so I'll start by letting the viewers know that I feel very fortunate to have started my journey in AI when I did. If I had done it about 6 months earlier, the tooling would not have been in place to allow for me to make as rapid progress as I have. So I heavily make use of APIs that allow for fine-tuning models. Our models are hosted on service providers. Our vector databases are hosted via a service provider. And so I've never had to really get really low level on training the model or anything like that. It's always been kind of
Mm.
abstracted for me. So maybe there's some advice just in that. Don't reinvent the wheel, right? Unless you absolutely have to. And there are cases where you absolutely have to, don't reinvent the wheel. Go find a service that does what you want and utilize that service. And if there's some reason why that doesn't work, then you can start considering, reinventing the wheel. But don't use that as a starting place. Definitely use the tools that are out there, and there are many.
Mhm. So when you did get started, what were the main technical challenges you ran into?
Well, I'll be honest, the first 6 months of the project was in that period of time where the tooling was, there was some tooling, but it wasn't readily available. And so I at first started kind of looking into it and realizing it was pretty much over my head. And I was trying to find somebody else who knew more about it than I did. And so while I was waiting for that, I kind of focused on the corpus itself, right? And so I actually built a tool that grabbed public domain theological works from archive.org and then built like a optical character recognition correction mechanism because like all those scanned texts that various companies had put in there like Google, they were scanned but they weren't corrected, or there was tons of printing errors or scanning errors and all those kinds of things. And so I built like this whole system to correct all of that while I was kind of trying to find somebody who really knew how to do AI because I knew that
Mm.
our approach would be heavily reliant on that corpus of information. So the first challenge was just finding somebody who knew about AI. And when I didn't find somebody who knew about AI, I had to learn it myself. But that slow ramp up to it gave the industry time to kind of catch up to the point where the tooling was in place where I could really kind of rapidly prototype what I wanted. And so as far as challenges go, definitely just finding somebody with the know-how. I don't think that's a challenge anymore, though. I think that nowadays that particular challenge is pretty much alleviated by the tooling that's available.
Hmm. Yeah. So you touched on this a little bit earlier, but finding sources, authoritative sources. So what would you consider as authoritative in your area? What would be a reliable training data? And what were some of the sources you used?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to talk about that. So first and foremost, I should state this up front. So we support a diversity of theological viewpoints within Orthodox Christianity, right? And so I am Protestant, but we support anybody from any of the three branches from Christendom, so Catholic, Protestant, or Eastern Orthodox. We allow for those viewpoints to be espoused. And that goes back to basically all three branches affirm the Nicene Creed, I think in 312 or so AD. And so that I should state that up front because that kind of impacts what we allowed in the corpus and so forth. So we went back and we got anything that was public domain Bible translations, right? So we're talking about any fragments or anything at all that was a public domain that was known to be kind of accurate translation. And then we went from there and added any of the works by the church fathers that were kind of agreed upon as not authoritative but in the same sense as scripture, but authoritative in the sense that it was accurate portrayals of what they believed and so forth. So we're talking about like Athanasius, Ignatius, Augustine, those kinds of folks, titans of the early church kind of thing. And then from there we went, up through the years and grabbed anything that was kind of well regarded in theological circles. Aquinas. On the more Catholic side, we got John Calvin Institutes of the Christian Religion. Lots of medieval scholars as well, right? Anything that's kind of been stood the test of time, right, and still in the public domain, we kind of gathered all the way up until kind of the 1800s, which anything in the U.S. at least is public domain after 100 years. Um, and then we also went out and got permission to use things that weren't in the public domain in certain cases. For example, maybe I can talk about this a little bit later, but we built specific variants of our chatbot that hone in on specific worldviews. And so we reached out to ministries that minister to that particular worldview and got permission to use their materials as well. So it's a pretty good diverse group of materials. The other thing I didn't mention is within Protestantism, sorry. We also have a plethora of denominational statements of faith as well. And again, like we're not we support we're ecumenical in the sense that we support a diversity of viewpoints. Even if I don't personally hold that viewpoint, I still think that it's valuable to surface those viewpoints as a viable kind of Orthodox Christian position.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I was about to ask about that as well. So, in terms of hermeneutics and gray areas, lots of denominations have specific viewpoints on certain things that may contradict each other because this Bible is not absolutely clear on subject X. So, how do you reconcile that?
So one of the advantages of retrieval augmented generation is that in real time you can turn sources on or off. And so we support anybody who wants to create a customized version of our chatbot to turn those sources on and off based on their own denominational preferences. So while we do support the ability to really be theologically constrained, our generalized chatbot is not. We have every full mix of all those denominational statements, right? And we did a fair amount of testing, and it doesn't seem the chatbot doesn't seem to get confused in that sense, but it does. We do support it stating various viewpoints as long as it is clear about what's common. For example, if you ask our chatbot, um, you know, um, do you need to perform sacraments to be saved, right? It will basically say like, well, Protestants believe that you don't, whereas Catholics have a different view of the sacraments. And so we're trying to build in like an open-handed approach towards some of these secondary theological issues.
It's funny that you mentioned that because that was actually one of the things I asked the chatbot. Um, okay. Thank you for your time, by the way. And I just have a few more questions here. Uh, what what would you improve for the future for your chatbot, and or what are your future plans for the chatbot?
So many things. There's so many things to do. So I think there is always fertile ground to improve the corpus. We're doing that daily. We're forming partnerships and getting more information. And there's also ways certainly that we can improve the system prompt or the programming that the chatbot, the entity that it kind of takes on, the persona. And so there's definitely a lot of things we can do to improve those things. But I'm most excited about what I alluded to before, which is these worldview specific chatbots. We have recently produced a chatbot that specifically ministers to Muslim seekers. And our tech is to the point where we can spin out a new chatbot variant with a custom corpus and specific system prompts and whatever other parameters we want to kind of bake into it. We can do that in 30 seconds. Like that's the tech is there. We can bust it out. It's on a wildcard subdomain on Vercel, and there is literally like no configuration that we have to do manually or anything like that. You just create it, and it's out in the wild. It's white labelable to the point where like you can customize the colors, the messaging, all that good stuff, right? But the bottleneck is not the tech at this point, really. The bottleneck is forming partnerships and getting the corpus to support those particular or not to support, but to answer questions from the seekers of those particular worldviews. So really the near-term future for us is moving beyond just the Muslim use case, which is I think is the primary one we were after, but we can move on to do any other world religion, but not only that, but different topics within secular humanism. For example, we're pursuing a relationship with a well-known ministry partner to develop a secular science serving chatbot right now.
Mm, that sounds very interesting. Love to talk to you more about this.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, just in closing, how do you promote your chatbot, and what's the best way to support your project if somebody's watching this and they want to support you?
Absolutely. So a couple ways. So you can always pray for us. We need lots of prayer. Any endeavor like this always needs plenty of spiritual cover. So we are a team of volunteers. This is not yet my full-time job, so I would one day love for it to be my full-time job, and that just depends on funding coming in and so forth. So if you're so led, financially supporting us would be great. You can go to apologistproject.org and go to the give button and support us that way. But if you're a student who doesn't have a lot of wealth but has a lot of time and energy that is interested in helping from a technical standpoint, we would also love that kind of support. So we have a Slack workspace. We meet weekly. And if you're interested in contributing or learning a little bit more about AI through a faith-based project like this, then we'd love to have your help. And you can contact Bobby for my contact information and get in touch with me that way. And I'd love to set up a meeting with you and discuss ways you can help.
All right, great. Thank you. You just answered my next two questions,
Oh, sorry.
which is
Bumped over the
awesome.
gun.
No, this is awesome. Yeah, it's really impressive what you've been able to do in a year. And I just, I just will wish you the best of luck on your on this venture. And I hope you are able to get a lot of volunteers and able to kind of ramp up this project even more.
Thank you.
So yeah, with that said, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.